Hi there, welcome back to The Conservative. I'm Mike Lannon, your host, and we're going to have a very quick 30 minutes. I've been thinking about this over the last 3 or 4 shows about today's show, and I thought this would be the good time to start talking about it because if you've been watching consistently, or if you haven't been watching consistently, you know from time to time I talk about the frog in the warm pan and the inability of the frog to get out of the pan when it heats up. Plenty of time while it's heating up to get out, but by the time it gets really hot, the frog can't get out. And we make that connection to what's going on in politics, the inability for us to escape the loss of our constitutional rights as they begin to stir the pot and heat it up. And by the time we recognize that people are not doing what they should do for this country, we fall apart and become something other than what we thought we were going to be 245, 47 years ago. So let's start with some brief history of how we got to the Judeo-Christian conservative view. And I got a couple of points that I want to make. One being the start of all of this, which is approximately 11 to 12,000 years ago. We're coming out of a massive ice age. Prior to that 12,000 years, we don't really know the history of mankind. There's evidence on this earth that there were civilizations long before that gigantic ice age. There's evidence on this earth that there were advanced civilizations. We just don't know enough about it to talk about it. And the archaeologists that explore this kind of information have all kinds of different theories about who was here, who wasn't here, all the way from Neanderthals, Cro-Magnon man and man somehow coming together and having humankind as we have it. We have, of course, Darwin's theory about we all evolved from apes. We have those who in modern times believe, like von Däniken, that we've come from aliens. We have all kinds of different theories about where we've come from, and one way or the other, approximately excuse me, approximately 12,000 years ago, we had a great flood. All of the civilizations that have a recorded history, including that which is an oral and recorded history, have mention of the Great Flood. Well, the Great Flood, as we know it, in the greatest written documents that we have, other than the one that appears to be older than the biblical record, is the record that comes out of the ancient Vedic texts out of India. Those texts have us way back to some very interesting times, and we can obviously, you could take and go back and start reading those, but that takes us back into that history that we don't have a lot of record on, and a huge controversy over what those legends are all about. Anyways, all those groups of people that have those different theories, other than Darwin, have certainly information based on those texts, and you can go and find those texts and try to find primary sources if you can, which means first sources, and go to work there. But when you go to the biblical text, and that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about today because it's the frog in the pot. Up until approximately 50 to 60 years ago, the Judeo-Christian ethic in America was being traditionally followed. And slowly but surely, since the 1890s, there's been a chip away at it by the progressive left, who believes that the first commandment that is in the Old Testament, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have any false gods before me, has been chipped away at, because we know that Karl Marx talked about the fact that in order to change our culture and our society, we had to remove that tradition. We had to remove the tradition of the religious belief. We had to take it down. We had to replace it with something else. We had to replace it with a different form of religion. So taking the first 3 laws of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, the ancient Jewish tradition that became part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Old Testament. And you take the first 3 commandments of the 10 that were handed to Moses on Mount Sinai, and they go basically in this order. I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have strange gods before me, thou shalt not take the Lord thy God's name in vain, and thou shalt remember to keep holy the Sabbath day. Those 3 laws were basically changed by Jesus when he said the 2 commandments that you should always keep in mind are love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul, and then the other side of the remaining 7 was to love thy neighbor as you would love thyself. Those were 2 of the laws that Jesus mentioned in his parable about how to follow Moses' commandments. Well, Karl Marx and the progressive left have decided that the only way to take this down over a long period of time is to remove that thinking from your mind. Those of you that are now part of the frog culture and you're allowing the water to boil. So what do? I have to exchange the first commandment, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have strange gods before me, with a new form of godship. Well, who would that godship be? Well, number 1, government, okay? Number 2, in that form of government, money. And the Bible talks about that, of course. Money is the root of all evil, okay? Money. And then finally, the new big one that they're overshadowing you with right now is climate change. And that has become a very big God-like figure. Let's keep focused on government, money, and climate, and we can get your mind off an all-knowing, all-being, omniscient God figure. So over the last 50 years, we've begun to peck away at that, chip away at it, and make people believe that there is no such thing as God. And then finally, therefore, we don't have to have that respect for a God. We can just say anything we want, and in particular, drop the foul language necessary to disrespect and take the Lord thy God's name in vain. So the first 2 commandments we've really chipped away at, which, because we've chipped away at them, have allowed us to now understand that we don't need to go to church on Sunday, don't need to go to church on Saturday, don't need to go to church on Friday, don't need to go to church on Thursday, don't need to go to church on Wednesday, don't need to go to church on Wednesday, Tuesday, or Monday, because it's not necessary. We can believe that God is within our own soul, and therefore we are God. That's exactly the wrong thought process. But because this is not a religious show, I'm trying to show to you how, or speak to you about how we are in the pot of the boiling water, and we're going to have great difficulty getting out of it. Keep this in mind, that Karl Marx is the man who said we need to destroy this belief system. President Obama also said we need to realize that these people are Bible-speaking, God-fearing, hard-working folks. He tried to make a demonstrated vocal mention of the remaining forces that had to be destroyed. That's what he meant by those words that he said. He was trying to take down the remaining people who believe in that former structure. So if I can take that all down and make government number 1, and the money that would come with allowing government to allegedly give you all that you need with free stuff, and then take away any need for any form of Sunday service, any form of reverence, adoration towards a God, and make it all government oriented, then I've now hit Karl Marx, I've now hit Nikita Khrushchev. For most of you sitting here watching this show don't even remember who he was, who said that was the way in which he would help conquer America through its school system and through the destruction of its religious principles. That's how do you attack it. Judeo-Christian constitution based on Judeo-Christian, the Ten Commandments. Destroy that and we can destroy the Constitution. We can boil the frog so it gets so hot that nobody dares to stand up against the oncoming slaughter of those who remain and believe in the former system. And that's exactly what's happening, because you can look and say to yourself, you may be watching the show right now and say, gee, I haven't been to church in a long time. Gee, I take the Lord thy God's name in vain all the time. I say JC or GD or all those other things, you know. We drop those words like it were nothing. And you just heard what I said. If you're lockstep in building a very big government, then you don't need to have a religious tenet. You don't have to even worry about the religious part of life, the spiritual side of things, because government is your spiritual side. Everything the government does for you is doing it for you. You can now get away from that. And how does that happen? Well, think about the side of what's going on in the country today. Most people will tell you that our mass shooters, our suicide rates, which is climbing, our depression models, is a lack of hope. There's no longer faith, hope, and charity within the structure of our communities. And so therefore, we rely on the government for our charity. Our faith is in the government, and our hope is in those politicians who are working for the government in hopes that they are going to give us a better way of life. That is not the Judeo-Christian principle, but we are throwing it out. We're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're beginning to believe what we're being told by someone who doesn't know. And it's easy for someone who has no biblical background, who hasn't been to church ever in their life, or has sat in a church of the chickens have come home to roost in America, or whatever else is being said off the pulpit that is anti-Judeo-Christian, anti-biblical standard, anti-biblical principles. It's easy then to convince other people to follow suit. And we then become the frog in the pot. And we don't realize that slowly but surely our church structure, our religious structure, which is the religious spiritual side of Judeo-Christian principles, is now being totally chipped away at and destroyed. And if you think not, go out and try to talk to someone about your religious principles. And right now, Christian principles are probably only being talked about in America by the Jehovah's Witnesses and probably the Seventh-day Adventist, I think it's called, Seventh-day Adventist, because they go out and they evangelize. They're out on the street. Now, there are other minor sects that are doing the same. In Rutland County, you have the fastest growing church because that's what they're doing. And this is not a show to advocate for any one religion, so I won't mention who they are, but there is one church in Rutland County that's growing and has been growing because that's what the guy is going out and doing. The preacher, the minister, is going out and he's taking care of the people's spiritual need by bringing them back to the biblical principles. Well, that's a small number. The larger number of population in this country is diminishing, moving away from the church, and there are very few people that are actually attending any kind of service. So where are they getting their spiritual religious needs? Well, I'm not religious. Well, that's not biblical, because religion means community. Community means worshiping together a God. Which God? Well, the God of Jehovah, the God of the Torah, the God of Moses. Okay? So that's the first principle, and then the God's Son, Jesus Christ, is the Judeo-Christian principle. Okay? So 2,000 years ago, 20 years or close to it now, Jesus Christ comes onto the earth and changes the world. Up until that time, you had, again, most of the world being controlled by government and the worship of many government-declared gods, including people like Caesar, and you can name the history, Alexander the Great. Those are two that I can think of instantly that declared themselves as gods. The pharaohs were gods, so they were men, women who were worshipped as gods, knowing everything. They were the government. They were taking care of the needs of the people. And so everybody knew in order to eat, in order to be clothed, in order to be housed, you had to worship this God. And heaven forbid if you didn't, because you wound up in the prison cells or, quite frankly, dead back there in those days. That was the ancient way of making sure that they kept people in line. So even up until 247 years ago, the godlike figures were the kings and queens, the dictators of the world. They were what was controlling things. And then along comes these phenomenal men and women of the original colonies in a little country called America. And they write this Constitution based on Judeo-Christian principles that now, over the last 50 years, maybe a little longer than that, people, well, I'm going to say since Woodrow Wilson, maybe a little sooner than that, but at least with Woodrow Wilson, the elimination of the Constitution, the desire to read that the Constitution is a living document, it should be changed with the modern times. No, that's not true. That's what a conservative will tell you. I'm going to tell you right now that the Constitution works, but you have to make sure that you understand what it's all about. And you can't have judges sitting on benches that then take and rewrite it by dictating to you their legislative procedure. This government of the United States was set up on Judeo-Christian principles that were based, in fact, on the laws of the Old Testament and New Testament, and they were based on the fact that we would have three separate equal branches of government that would watch over each other. So we have that problem now because we have government money and climate change as our wonderful expressed new God. And so if you don't lock step with that, then you're out of tune and the progressive left will go right after you. And that's what's going on right now with the new president. That contest, the election of 2016, is still being fought tooth and nail with deep state, God-like authority to overthrow the President of the United States. That's exactly what's happening. And you have to go out and you have to take a look at that and realize that thou shalt not bear false witness, which is one of the 7 remaining commandments that I didn't talk about this afternoon. It's way up there in number 9, I believe. Could be number 10, I've forgotten the exact order, but the last 3 are all about the neighbor and the wife and not coveting goods, wife, and bearing false witness. So bearing false witness is a complete onslaught of one of the remaining tenets of Moses and the 10 Commandments coming off the Mount Sinai. Well, what does that mean, not bear false witness? It means just that. You don't lie about someone, you don't make up stories about somebody, and you don't take and fabricate information in order to get your way. That is bearing false witness. That's what's going on in America today. That's this big scandal you keep hearing about down in the swamp. You have folks who are on the progressive left. There's no question that if you go out there and read that history carefully, that you're going to find that back before 2016, back in 2011, 2012, 2013, the deep state was being built very deeply. It's there before that too, but coming out of the Bush administration into the Obama administration, when he said to us he was going to fundamentally change this government. Well, fundamentally change the government means you've got to do some fundamental changes in the government itself. So where do I do that? I have to do it in the deep state areas of the law. Well, where is the law? The CIA, the national NIA, or the National, forgot what that stands for, but it's the National Defense Program, and then of course the FBI. And if you think about all the people that are involved in the scandals with Benghazi, the scandals that are involved with the illegal FISA warrants to build a dossier through Ukraine against President Trump, those all came prior to 2016. That was all information that was bearing false witness. It was those in that community of those three that wanted to take down the possibility of any president, Republican, that might get elected. Well, of course, Donald Trump won the primary, and so the war was on. Now, if you look back at the TV, and the one that I like the best is when the media is sitting around a round table, there's 6 or 7 media folk asking very deep conservative Ann Coulter about who might win the presidency of the United States. And she said, of all those who are running right now, the one and only person that would become president of the United States was Donald Trump. And she knew, as well as Donald Trump, what the feelings were in America, the disgust that we had coming out of 8 years of things like the Benghazi situation, the inability to get anything done by Mr. Obama that helped anybody do anything other than we recognize, most Americans, that there's fraud, graft, criminal activity going on in the Progressive Party. Does that mean it's not going on in the Republican Party? I hate to tell you this, it's going on in both parties. There is a swamp. Trump is right. There is a swamp. We're sending people down to Washington that are coming back home, multimillionaires. Well, how are they making that multi-million dollars if they're not selling their souls, bearing false witness, stealing, which is the 7th commandment, many of them committing stealing the 5th commandment, many of them committing, no, stealing is the 7th, 5th commandment is thou shalt not kill, and there's certainly that possibility. All those things, you know, and of course you have to read these kinds of things because a lot of this stuff is just nothing but conspiracy. There's no proof, no fact, okay? But there's enough out there for me to be talking about the facts as I'm able to read them and not just take one source. I'm looking for primary sources. I'm looking for reliable sources, both left and right. You realize as I sit here, there are people that write on the left, in other words, the Democratic side, the progressive side, who tell the truth. They are able to tell the truth. They're not in the newspaper. They're not in magazines, and they usually aren't on the major networks. They are on the internet with fact-finding truthfulness. And there are people on the right that are telling the truth. They don't have a slant, right or left. They're trying to come down on the truth of what they're able to discover as being true investigative reporters, not throwing their opinions in. For instance, on Fox News, you have Shepard Smith. Shepard Smith alleges himself, claims to be a news reporter, and yet over the last 6 weeks, he has consistently thrown in his opinion during his show. You just listen to it. That makes him an opinion piece, not a news reporter. That's a problem. So Fox News can't say we are unbiased, we're fair and balanced if they've got a news reporter literally saying the things that he said over the last 6 weeks, which is very anti-Trump. So that makes that program, even though it's allegedly on Fox News, who most people will say is a news organization that is leaning to the right. I would disagree with that. I see many shows on Fox News that I don't agree with. Mike Wallace is one. I think he's Leland Vitter I don't particularly like. I think he doesn't give his people a chance to speak. But that's the same on I can name the reporters on MSNBC that I watch, on CNN, that are supposed to be reporters, and yet Wolf Blitzer on CNN often throws in his opinion. He should then become like Hannity. When I watch Hannity, I know for a fact that he is an opinion show. He tells you right up front, this is an opinion show. Guess what? You're watching an opinion show right now. This is not a news show where I'm just reporting to you the facts. I'm also saying that there are facts with my conservative view. That makes it an opinion show. So when you're watching Mike Lannon on The Conservative, you're watching an opinion show. I have the right still under the First Amendment to come up with my opinion based on the facts that I can discover and the facts that I can discern and the facts that I can sift through based on my own depth of knowledge. So each and every one of you can do that. You have an advocacy position. You have a position from which you start any kind of a conversation. That position either can be balanced with good inquiry, where you ask good questions that builds on your depth of knowledge, or you don't. And if you hold fast to your opinion, then you have what they call a fixed mindset. You have no ability then to grow. I basically have a growth mindset. I'm more than willing to sit down and listen to people on the opposite side of my opinion. I learned that and learned to do that in college. That's where most colleges are supposed to be doing that for you. Today's colleges are not doing that. Today's colleges are very expensive. Today's universities, colleges, they're very expensive. And from what I have been able to gather, most of the professors are opinionated with only their opinion. They're not allowing students to explore and discover for themselves learning, relearning, and knowledge and understanding. Well, you can't have wisdom if you don't have understanding. You can't have understanding if you don't have knowledge. And you have to have knowledge that comes down on all sides of an issue. Otherwise, you can't develop understanding. Otherwise, you cannot develop wisdom, and you cannot advance civilization. You cannot advance yourself. You cannot advance anyone in your view and venue of persuasion. You can't. So if I only want to argue from one position, and it's always the same position with no other explanations being given to me or allowed into my mental growth, then I become stagnant. So many of the things that I tell you don't necessarily come all right from the right. They come from every kind of source that I can get my hands on that I can then take and look at, make some discernments, and then add to my own depth of knowledge and say, this makes sense to me. Because I often say to myself, does it make sense? Is that possible? For instance, the frog in the pot. Does that make sense? Has there ever been an experiment? Is that only a myth? Has there ever been an experiment where they've tried a frog in the pot to see if he can jump out as it gets hotter? Yes, they have, and they found out that he cannot. And that's why that story has come down as one of the stories of how the frog in the pot cherishes the warm water until it gets to the point where he now cannot get out. He's basically cooking. Same thing with a human. You all are in the same pot. We are in the pot called America, the melting pot. How are we going to make sure that our Constitution remains solid over the next, I would say the next 100 years, but I'm not even sure we can last a century if we don't get our handle around the politics of it all. We cannot have the right and the left doing what they're doing right now and continue to have a constitutional America. You cannot have the left deciding that the election is all bogus and then fight for the next whatever number of years. And mark my word, it's going to haunt the Democrats in the next election. They're not going to find anything on Donald Trump. They've tried and they've tried and they've tried. They've tried for 3 years. They're going to go right to 2020. They've got this deep state whistleblower that they changed the law on. Up until 1 month ago, you could not be a whistleblower if indeed you did not have first-hand primary sources. Now they're allowing a whistleblower to use second and third-hand hearsay evidence to become a whistleblower and protect that person. No, you cannot do that. That's like me saying, okay, whoever's sitting out there in the audience watching this show tonight, I might as well just go down the street and say, you know, that person that's on that couch watching this show tonight, they're an SOB. Okay, Mike, I believe you because you said so. Where did I get that information? I didn't hear anybody. I've never even seen that person that's watching this show tonight. I don't know who you are. So follow what I'm saying. If I don't know who you are, I've never been in the room with you, I can't possibly say who you are, what you might be like. I can't form an opinion, and I certainly can't go out into the neighborhood and say, you know, so-and-so is an SOB. I can't do that because I don't know. Well, next time I'm in the show, I'll come back around to this very point again because it's very important that everybody understands what the frog in the pot is like. See you next time. Thanks for watching.